And there we go. Okay. So we were talking about the hallmarks of life. And the first one was life is organized. And we started digging through the different levels, right? We started with the atom and we moved all the way up, and here we are at the cell. And so we talked about this concept of emergent properties, where each systems level gives you a set of properties that the last system didn't have. All right, and so you could make an argument that life is an emergent property of organized matter. All right, and we'll talk about cells in much more detail later on. So the next one was that life reproduces and develops. Right, so when we talk about reproduction, we're just talking about cells begetting cells begetting cells. And notice I have the question marks in the beginning here. And that's because we don't know where the first cells came from. Right? Evolutionary biology doesn't tell us the origin of life. That is one of the most common misperceptions of the theory. They say you give an evolutionary biologist a cell and they will give you the world, but ask where that first cell came from and they'll shrug their shoulders and say, we don't know, we're not sure, but we're working on it. And I'm plugging in my tablet here so I can draw. Right? So evolution theory does not tell us where the first cells came from. It tells us, it explains for us the unity of life and the diversity of life. Okay, when we talk about growth, we're talking about, in one context, multicellular organisms like us start as a single cell, and then we get up to about 32 trillion cells. Your body has, on average, about 32 trillion cells, and you're making 100,000 cells every second of every day. And the reason you're not getting any bigger is because you're also killing 100,000 cells every second of every day, on average. Right? When it comes to growth at the unicellular level, we're talking about a bacterial cell that can take on size. Right? That's really not that big of a deal. And then I don't know what this little red thing is here. Darn it. That's from last time. I just didn't delete it. All right, and then development. Okay, when we talk about development, we're talking about a cell taking on a specialized role and taking a specialized structure, right? One of the defining features of multicellularity, which distinguishes us from unicellularity or colonial. All right, so let's make sure we understand that there are, let me get my pen here. There's unicellular organisms, unicellular, and they can either be solitary or they can be colonial. All right, in other words, balls of cells, they're all the same. That's the key, that's what makes them colonial. Okay, so unicellular life can either swim by itself, sometimes you might call this free living, a free living bacterium or free living protist. Okay, multicellular life, the key here is specialization. So specialization is one of the defining features of evolutionary biology. As time goes on, things tend to get more specialized. It makes things more efficient. This concept of specialization, if you ever go on to study economics, you'll also see that in macroeconomics. Countries trading with each other, instead of being generalists and doing everything themselves, farm out certain tasks to other countries. For example, in America right now, over the last 30, 40 years, we've handed off our manufacturing in large part to China because China can manufacture much more easily. Whereas what we offer, really, the thing that America exports is financial services right now. That's our big thing. So specialization is this concept over time. And so when we talk about development, we're talking about multicellular organisms, the cells within them specializing. All right, so we go from a zygote that's totipotent, meaning it can turn into any other kind of cell type, into the different lineages of the, so we go into developmental biology here, right? And so my question to you is, what decides that this embryo here develops into a human or a mouse, right? So if I have one cell here, and this cell eventually turned into a little embryo, And this cell also turns into a little embryo. And at some stages, those two things look exactly the same. Eventually, one turns into a human and one turns into a mouse. What makes those two cells different? What determines that? What do you think? Hey, Dan, I just saw you pop in there. Right.
When mutations.
Oh, okay, mutations. So what's the underlying implication there? What gets mutated? Think simple. High level systems approach. What's
Their body, like their physical form.
So no, so their physical form is what is the end game of what I'm talking about, right? So the end game is you're a mouse or you're a human. What determines that? So you have these two embryos in petri dishes. They look exactly the same. Ultimately, one's going to start looking different than the other, and one's going to eventually become human, and one's going to become a mouse. What determines that?
Is it DNA, RNA, or genetics?
You got it. It's their underlying DNA code. Okay, that's what makes it different. Is the DNA sequences we have. It turns out, if you look at the human genome and compare that to the mouse genome, we share about 86% of the genetic material in common with a mouse. Which, if you think about it, that's kind of mind-blowing, right? Little annoying things that destroy your basement. Yeah, we had mouse problems a couple years ago. All right, energy processing. Just quickly, we talk about consuming energy. All right, we'll talk about this when we do thermodynamics. So I'm going to skip that for now. Briefly, I'll say that energy is a potential to do work, and work itself is moving matter. Breaking, building, pushing, pulling, twisting. Cells are constantly doing work, and so they need a constant supply of energy. Okay. And cells do all sorts of work, but basically you can divide into broad categories. And we'll do this when we do cell biology. You got mechanical work, you have chemical work, and you have transport work. Those are the three basic kinds of things that cells do. That makes sense, right? They move things around, they transport things across their membrane, and they perform a bunch of metabolic reactions. All right. And then is energy all we need? And the answer is no, right? You can't do anything if you just have energy. You need building blocks, right? You can't build a house with just your muscles, right? You need lumber and nails and all that good stuff. So you talk about these two things together usually. You talk about material and energy. Okay, I usually abbreviate energy with an E in a circle. So material, so think about plants. Plants don't just need sunlight, right? They need sunlight, they need carbon dioxide, they need phosphorus and sulfur from the soil. They need water, right? So they need their materials and their energy. Okay, so the other thing I'll say here at this point is that energy flows through systems. Energy does not cycle. Energy starts at one point and it leaves, right? So in our case, you can think of energy very simply going from the energy of the sun to the earth to space, right? So energy is constantly flowing through the system. It stays for a little while because we have this atmosphere. Our atmosphere acts like a blanket, and so it traps the heat in there for a little while, but it leaks it into space. And so the energy eventually does go away. All right, and we'll talk about this in chapter 7 or 8. It's 7, I think. Okay, and then there's this other concept here called regulation, right? So life regulates itself. Because if a cell didn't do anything, right, what would happen over time? Think about it. What would happen to a cell if it halted all of its work? You stop giving it energy. And we have this little cell here. It's got the nucleus and all this stuff, right? If he didn't have the energy to pump toxins out, and he didn't have the energy to bring in the needed materials, and water's always gently coming into a cell, especially if it's in a freshwater environment. So that cell would have to constantly pump water out, right? So if a cell stops doing work, it dies. All cells will die very quickly if they are not able to regulate their internal environment. And so we call this internal environment homeostasis, or the regulation of it, homeostasis. Homeo, same, stasis, still. All right. So the idea here is you're different than the outside environment. The cell's internal environment is fundamentally different than the outside. And homeostasis is all about keeping it that way. All right. So one of the concepts here is you have all of these various characteristics, things like your pH or your blood sugar or your temperature, whatever. And there's a range, high to low, right? And notice that there's two lines here, not one. There's a comfortable range. There's not just one, right? If it's 70 degrees and you're comfortable, and then the temperature goes to 69 degrees or 71 degrees, you don't suddenly go, oh my God, I'm uncomfortable, right? You might notice it, but you're still fine. It's once you get too far one way or the other. Okay, so there's this, it's a fuzzy distinction here. Once you do go too far one way or the other, we call that stress. I mean, that's what stress is fundamentally. It's a deviation from homeostasis. It's a disequilibrium. And so the body or the mind or the population or whatever fights to get back into the green, right? That's why you're hungry or you're thirsty or you're shivering or you're sweating. It's all about getting back to the middle there. So I like this idea here of you have the Goldilocks concept, right? You got to be somewhere in the middle. So this porridge is too hot, this porridge is too cold, and this porridge is perfectly balanced. If you know Thanos from the Marvel movies, right? So anyway, that joke's going to get older and older, and eventually I have to remove it. But I think it's still fresh enough. It can stay there. Okay. Now, if homeostasis talks about stillness, metabolism is all about movement. Metabol is that underlying Greek word meaning move. And the metabolism is moving to keep the body in place. And so collectively, you can think about this whole concept of regulation as being on a treadmill, right? You're running on a treadmill just to stay in place. You're putting all this work in just to be the same. And so all that work being done by cells, we call that the metabolism, okay? So the simplest way to think of it is it's the sum total of all of the reactions in your body or in the cell, okay? And simply put, you can think about it as two fundamentally different kinds of reactions. There's reactions where we take a thing and we break it, okay? So you can think about this as going downhill, right? So this downhill breaking, what that's gonna do is release energy as it falls apart, okay? These are the realm of catabolic reactions or catabolism. This is what you do when you eat food, okay? We eat food to get energy out of it. That makes sense intuitively, right? And then we take this stuff, right? We take those building blocks. Those could be amino acids. Those could be monohybrids. Oh my God, we're getting to genetics. Monosaccharides. Those could be, those are the two basic things, amino acids and monosaccharides. And then we can use those to build things, and let's make it something new, right? So we started with the circle here, that's your food. We got some energy out of it, okay? And then we're going to use that energy to drive these building reactions to go up from pieces up. And so these are called anabolic reactions, okay? Or anabolism, and that requires energy, right? The energy gets released by our catabolism and absorbed by our anabolism. Okay, so if you think about it, we destroy the beautiful house, we just destroy it, and then we take the pieces of the house and we build a new house in our own image, according to what we want to do. I mean, there's some really interesting philosophy there. Destroy the tree to make the person, right? I mean, it's just an interesting way of thinking about it. We're destroying organization, we're destroying structure, so that something else can have order. So, okay, so that's regulation, that's metabolism. Okay, when we say response to the environment, we're talking about reacting to extrinsic factors like a fire, right? I mean, that's the key here. So your environment, when we make sure you understand these fancy words, extrinsic versus intrinsic. These are a yin yang pair that you should have in your head pretty well. So if something's extrinsic, that means it's outside the system. If something's intrinsic, it means it's within the system. Okay, there's another set of words you might come across in biology. Endogenous, oops, I just put an extra O in there. Endogenous versus exogenous. All right, so for example, if you're doing experiments in the lab and you're playing with genes, an endogenous gene would be part of your genome. It'd be part of the natural part. An exogenous gene would be one you stick in there on purpose, whether you infected it with a virus or you put a plasmid in there or whatever. And exogenously expressed versus endogenous. All right, extrinsic versus intrinsic. So response to the environment is all about extrinsic factors, whereas regulation talks about response to intrinsic variables, right? Like your blood sugar. Okay. All right. And then the last thing here, evolutionary adaptation. Make sure you understand the distinction between adaptation versus response. Okay. So we as individuals respond to our environment, but species collectively over time adapt to their environment. Okay. And so we talk about this as evolutionary adaptation. So this is what ties life together. Life itself has a core set of components that are the same. That's what Bio 121 is all about, is learning that set of similarities. Bio 2 is going to be all about the diversity of life. All right, so like really you could do, this is Bio 121, and this is 122. Okay. And then here on the right, there's two basic words I'll introduce you to, and that is well, really the biggest word here on this slide is homology. This is the most important one to understand. Homology is an evolutionary term. When two things are homogeneous or homologous, that means that they share a common ancestor over evolutionary time. We'll talk in genetics about homologous chromosomes. That means that there was a common ancestor. All right, so these are homologous structures. For example, if you look at a salamander, crocodile, bird, bat, whale, mole, and human appendage, they all have exactly the same number of bones, and each one of those bones is attached in the exact same location as all the other bones, right? And the one that really blows me away the most here, the one that really speaks most to this whole concept is the whale. Okay, this is a whale flipper. I mean, think about how whales swim. They just this big flipper. It looks like a fish flipper, right? But when you look inside a fish flipper, for rayed fish, bony rayed fish, it looks like that. Whereas when you look at a whale flipper, it's got thumbs in there. You don't see whales going around giving thumbs up. That'd be fun, but they don't. But they have a thumb, right? Why would a whale have a thumb? That makes no sense. Why do they have a hip bone? Because their ancestors had hip bones and thumbs and did use them for something, right? And we have the same bones. The phalanges and the carpals and the metacarpals and the femurs and the tibias and the fibulas, they're all connected in exactly the same way. Okay, so I like to think of these, imagine each of these bones was made out of like a durable but malleable clay. And you were able to twist it and maneuver it and sculpt it. And that's what happens over evolutionary time. We get sculpted by our environments. Okay, the human foot is a beautiful example. Our foot is the weirdest foot in the animal kingdom. And our leg is very odd. The way our knee and our feet are, it's all about running. It's all about running over distances. Our feet are one of the most highly adapted structures in our body when it comes to our environment. All right. Now, analogy means it has the same function, but it didn't have a common ancestor. In other words, over evolutionary time, we find that certain characteristics emerge simply through necessity. Right? Think about an insect wing versus a bird wing. They both fly, but there's no common ancestor between the bird wing and the insect wing. Likewise, the bird and bat wings are a beautiful example of both homology and analogy, right? So the homology is there in the bones, right? They both have the same bones, but there is no bird bat ancestor that flew. Okay, birds figured out how to fly in a completely different manner than bats figuring out how to fly at different times. They have different mechanics, right? If you ever think about how a bird flies, it's very elegant, right? Whereas the way a bat flies is like he's ready to just bump into something at a moment's notice. They just fly completely differently. Bats fly with their fingers, right? They have those fingers extended, whereas birds have feathers sticking. They're highly evolved scales, basically, which all drive all the way back to fish scales, right? So dinosaurs had fish-like scales that they had feathers too. Birds use those feathers to fly. Okay, so that's the difference between analogy and homology. Okay, and then as a primer, I'm going to just give this to you as a very quick primer. I don't expect you to know super details here. You will study this next semester. But as natural selection works, you can. This is currently in the kindergarten classroom in the UK. This is all kids are learning this now, and that's because that's the only way that you get people to stop rejecting evolution theory, is by teaching it to them young. So the idea is, it's very simple and it's very intuitive, and you can go home or you're home now. You can. That was left over from me being in the classroom. You can stay home and talk to others also in your home about this now. So the idea is this: you have a population, right? You have a whole bunch of individuals in a population, and naturally they all have variations, right? All sorts of variations. We'll talk about this when we do genetics in a couple weeks. And so some of those variations, not all of them, but some of those variations are genetic. They're heritable. I mean, you can pass those variations on to your offspring. All right, so that's the first fact. The second is not all offspring survive. Right, now in nature, it's way more prevalent than in human culture, especially here in America, where our mortality rate or our infant mortality rate is not nearly what it is out in the wild, right? But okay, so we had a pair of baby birds this weekend. We had it's called the Carolina wren made a nest in our garage and laid some eggs, and there were two little babies in there. And we've been tracking them over the last couple weeks. And those two little babies decided, I was looking at them, they're just right here on the shelf and they're adorable. And as I was looking at them, they flew out of the cage, they flew out of their nest, just right at me. And I ended up having to handle these cute little baby birds. So I was reading about how to take care of them, what to do, and really you're not supposed to do anything, just put them on the ground. But it was in my garage, so I tried to put them back in their nest. They just wouldn't have anything. They didn't want to have anything to do with the nest anymore. But in my research, I learned that only about 30% of fledgling songbirds survive their first year of life. That's a terrible percentage, right? And I was really sad to hear that, because I held one of them was a very strong flyer and was really aggressive. The other one was like, I like your hand, please don't leave me alone. I'm like, you're not going to make it in the wild, buddy. It was really sad. So the 30% chance here. The point is that only the ones that are most adapted to their environment make it. And there's also luck involved. And in fact, modern evolutionary theory is taking luck into account more and more, it turns out. Luck plays a much stronger, as a guiding force, it turns out, in the economy and in evolution. All right, but the idea here is not everybody survived because there's limited resources, and so therefore competition. All right, so some of the offspring will survive better. They'll have a higher % chance of survival because of those natural variations. And so because they survive, they are the ones that pass on their genes, not the others. And so you just keep repeating that over and over and over again, right? And eventually you have change over time. It's that simple. Okay. And in this underlying concept, as simple as that sounds, that is the umbrella over all of biology. Evolution theory is to biology as atomic theory is to chemistry, and as quantum mechanics and Newton's mechanics are to physics. Okay, so without evolution, biology is just a seemingly disconnected set of facts. Okay, it just, nothing makes sense. Biology only makes sense if in light of or through the lens of evolution. Okay, all right. So hold on, let me get back here. And I just realized I need to pick up my pace a little bit. So the idea, so Darwin really, his idea of natural selection spawned from the fact that man was always back in, you know, up until the 1800s, we had various varieties of things. We had, whether it was peas or carrier pigeons. Darwin did a lot of work with carrier pigeons. He interviewed a bunch of people that did work with, you know, selective breeding and all that. And so even today, if you look at the wild mustard plant, all of these things along here, kale and Brussels sprouts and broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower, all those things that you really don't enjoy eating too much, but you know you should, come from a wild mustard plant, right? So if we selected for just the leaves, we get kale. If we selected for the flower buds in the stem, we got broccoli. If you select for the lateral leaf buds, you got Brussels sprouts. Terminal leaf buds, you get cabbage. And the flower buds, you get cauliflower, right? So in other words, you just take wild mustard and you look for, of the 1,000 you have there, you pick the one that's got the best flower buds. And you only select, you take those and you keep doing that over the generations. And you can sculpt them over time, right? So kale and cauliflower are the same thing. They're all mustard. And now you're like, you just broke my brain. That doesn't make, I don't like mustard. I don't like cauliflower. Actually, it's all connected. That's why I don't like any of it, right? Or maybe you do, I don't know. Maybe you enjoy all these things. I definitely don't. I'll eat kale in a salad, but only with a heavy dose of like other tasty things in there. Never Brussels sprouts. Ugh. Okay, so that's hallmarks of life. All right, we're done with that. So this next little chunk here, I'm gonna fly through it. Now there's reading in your book. There's chapter 1 has a section, and then there's another section later in your book. I think it's like chapter 26 or something. I have this written down for you in my my class schedule. But so I'll publish that. Actually, here, I'll give it to you right now, so that if I don't post this earlier, I can give it to you. So it's section. Where is it? Okay, it's sections 1.1 and 1.2, but then 26.1 and 26.6. And there's a figure, 26.23. Okay, here, I'll paste that into chat as well. Where's chat? Oh, I have to bring chat up again here. Okay, so that's the order to life, systematics. And I'm not going to spend time on it in a lecture, but I want you to read those things. Okay, and again, that's more Bio 2 stuff. But here's the basic idea. All of life on Earth stems from a common ancestor. And so what we can do is we can track that divergence over time. All right, so each individual group or cluster of species we call, we would call it a clade. So that's one way to call it. A clade is a group of species that all have, that we're considering, all right? You can also call them a taxon. All right, so a taxon is a group of species with some set of common characters. So you would say that mammals are a taxon. You would say animals are a taxon. You would say eukaryotes are a taxon, okay? And so taxonomy is all about grouping things according to what they look like, according to their common characteristics and features. It has nothing to do with their genes, everything to do with their outward appearance. Because up until the 80s, really, we couldn't do any genetic investigations. So everything up until the 1980s was done through taxonomy. Okay, so when we classify life, when we pick up an organism and we consider it, what is this thing? We, as humans, our brains are naturally systematists. We are all natural systematists. That's one of the things that our intelligence has given us. It's a survival technique. This berry, oh, I got sick, maybe I died. And the other person who saw me eat that berry and died was like, okay, we don't eat those red berries that look like that. And we'll remember that, so we won't get poisoned next time. Oh, these blueberries, we can eat these, we can't eat the red ones, right? So we categorize things instinctually. That's just what we do, right? Or imagine you're at a red light, you're late for work, you're late for class, and there's the road right now in front of you is converging into a single lane, right? So you're next to another car and the light's red, and you're sitting there wondering if you should gun it and get ahead of the next car, or if you should hold back and let them go first. And so a quick glance at that car and you've already made your decision, because we have to make decisions fast. They're not always right, but on average, they tend to be. That's why we have stereotypes, right? Stereotypes are mental shortcuts. You turn to your right and you see a bright red car being driven by some 30-year-old convertible, and you can hear his engine revving. You're like, I'm gonna let you go. All right, if you look at that car and it's 20 years old and it's beige and it's being driven by somebody who's 40 years older than you and they can't see too well because they're short, you're probably not gonna wanna be behind them, right? We judge these things, and again, we're not always right. For example, if the light goes green, the guy in the red car looks at you, smiles, and gestures you to go first, and you're like, that never happens, but it does, right? So everybody is an individual and makes their own decisions on things. But our brains are wired to presuppose things. It's a survival technique. And what makes us human, from the psychology perspective of it all, is our ability to identify our own natural animal biases and to overcome them, right? They're all in there though. So when we classify things instinctually, we do it with the goal of putting together a single tree of life where every group comes from other groups, okay? And that's called phylogeny. Phylogeny. Phylogeny is our evolutionary connections, all right? Now, we can get it kind of accurate based on how things look, but we get things wrong sometimes, right? Because things don't always look, or things aren't always what they seem. Like the red panda is not a panda, it's a fox, it turns out, right? But its name is red panda. A starfish is not a celestial body, nor is it an aquatic animal that swims around, right? A starfish is neither. But we have these names, right? When we name things, and then we categorize things, all right? So everything has a name and a category, right? So I'm Andrew Ippolito, right? Currently my category is teacher, right? I'm also dad. I'm also tractor repairman and microwave repairman and technical support, right? I have all these hats I'm wearing, okay? So categories can change. The name doesn't change, right? And that's true in biology too. All right, so when we name things according to a very formal naming discipline called binomial nomenclature. All right, that's right. Hold on. I thought I had a slide on. Wait, is that it? Well, yeah, I have the word. What's nomenclature mean? When we say nomenclature, that's just a group. It's a paradigm of language specific to some discipline. If you've ever heard two people talk, you've heard a shop talk. So think of two car mechanics talking about the engine, right? You're listening to these two people talk and you hear English words, but you have no idea what they're talking about, right? Or one thing I like to hit students with is, this is what I worked on. I worked on human cytomegalovirus's immediate early protein IE72 and its simulation of the promyelocytic leukemia protein, PML. I studied the gene regulation of PML. I studied the interactions between IE72 and PML in the context of oxidative stress. And in the context of phosphorylating, I was also mapping phosphorylation sites on E2Fs 1 through 6, and its interactions between the P130 and PRB proteins. And you're like, that sounds boring. Really, it was boring. That sounds complicated. I heard the word "the." That's pretty much the only word in there. Assimilation, I heard the word, I have no idea what we're talking about. That's nomenclature. Okay, so binomial nomenclature is that paradigm of how we name everything in biology. All right, and the way you name something in biology is you steal its category at the bottom there. You steal its genus and species names, right? So like we are Homo self, we're naming ourselves. That's why we're Homo sapien. We think, okay? We're Homo sapiens. That's our genus, because there's others, right? There's Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal, and this is our species name. Okay, so our name derives from our categories. All right? So that's all I'll say about that. So these are cladograms. There's different ways that you can draw cladograms. This is a circular cladogram, right? There's also vertical cladograms and horizontal cladograms and vertical cladograms. Well, cladograms are just visual representations of relationships. They're not set in stone. You can think of them as visual hypotheses, right? I mean, consider the two differences between that cladogram and that cladogram, right? Or here, you can do this, you can make it look like this. So there's this cladogram, right? So there's 3 species here, species A, B, and C, let's say. Okay, or there's this cladogram. Okay, do you see how different? So you would say that A and B do not have a recent common ancestor, right? They came from different species altogether. Whereas here, you could see that B came from A. So these two cladograms tell different stories. Okay, the goal of these cladograms is to put them together in such a way such that each species has common ancestors. Okay, so a cladogram that has all of the species that we're talking about, A, B, and C, all having a common ancestor, that's called monophylogenetic or monophylogeny. All right, that's the goal of systematics, is to build one big, massive monophylogenetic tree. Okay. If I considered A, B, C, and D, do you see how A and B have a common ancestor that's different than C and D, right? This would be called polyphylogenetic. Genetic. All right, that means you got something wrong. So let me say that differently. If we called that group A, B, C, and D birds, okay, we can't call that group a single name because they have different common ancestors. And our goal is to create groups with common ancestors, right? So when we were all kids, all of us, however old we all are here, when we were kids, some of us younger than others, the idea of a bird and a reptile, those were two different taxons. Those were two different taxa. The plural of taxon is taxa, right? Today, because we've done enough sequencing and genetic analysis, I can tell you that they are all the same group. In other words, birds and reptiles are polyphylogenetic. So we have to reclassify them now. We've done this already. They're all reptiles. Okay, and so we now talk about reptiles as either being avian reptiles, birds, or non-avian reptiles, right? Dinosaurs came from avian reptiles, or I should say avian reptiles, birds came from dinosaurs, the sauropods. Okay, so as we learn things, we keep changing it up. And we are right now in a renaissance of systematics. We're still figuring it out right now. The tree of life is getting shuffled around right now. I taught invertebrate zoology for 2 springs. The last spring I did it was I think 2 springs ago. So I did it 2 springs ago and then the spring before that. And they used different versions of the textbook. I just happened to be in the wrong time at the wrong place. They switched the textbooks when I did after I did it the first time. And the difference in the family trees between the various animal phyla was staggering. Like annelids, earthworms, their entire tree is upside down right now, and it remains to be clarified. All right, so that's systematics. That's all I'll say about it. Okay. Now, what I want you to put in your head, memorize, is the current pecking order of taxonomy. This doesn't change. What changes is where we put things. Right. We'll always have classes and orders and families. It's just we don't know where the species go. Right. So this is the current taxonomic structure. We have domains. There's 3 domains of life. There's the eukaryotes, the prokaryotes, and the archaeans. All right, so here we have 1, 2, 3. Oh, hold on, I have a picture. Hold on, here we go. Here's the way the tree of life is set up right now. The 3 master domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay, those are the domains of life. Now, in taxonomy, you can have super and sub taxons. So I like to say that prokaryote and eukaryote are superdomains. And this is becoming something more and more accepted. It's not a consensus yet. There are some scientists that still just use these as body types. But really, there's only 2 kinds of cells in the world. There's prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Within the prokaryotes, you have your bacteria and your archaeans. All right. Now, most of us don't know the distinction between these 2. And that's because they look very similar to each other. They're simple, single-celled life. The thing you can distinguish them for simply right now is that archaeans live in extreme environments. They're the extremophiles. That's the simplest way to do it, whereas bacteria are everywhere. All right. Eukaryotes include both the single-celled protists, of which you'll see here, there are many, 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 many kingdoms of protists. All right. So the protists are not a kingdom anymore. This changed in about 1997 or so. So instead, we use the word protist as a collective junk drawer for single-celled eukaryotes that don't otherwise fit one of the other kingdoms. All right, so there's like 30 different kingdoms of protists. And then you have the plants, animals, and fungus. Those are all the multicellular eukaryotes. Okay, so multicellularity evolved after protists did. And really, I don't even like the way this family tree is. This is how I do it. Ready? Here's Luca, the last universal common ancestor. And so Luca arose, and to this day, you still have bacteria. Okay. You in this Luca collection, you also had the archaeans. They diverged. Okay. And then from some loose collection of these, you had the protists arise. So in other words, eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes. Okay. And we'll learn about that when we do cell biology. From the protists, which exist today, and they diversified, there are so many protists. This is all polyphyletic. That's why we don't call them one thing anymore. The protists also gave rise to these guys, the opisthokonts, which is a word you're not going to see again for a very long time, but this is fun to know. The opisthokonts are the common ancestor between the animals and the fungus. the fungi, the fungi. All right. And then separately out of the Protists arose the plants. So in other words, you have a common ancestor with a mushroom before you have a common ancestor with an oak tree. Okay, so that's how I like framing the tree of life and the concept of who came from who, because when you look at it this way, it makes more sense. The Protists were there first, and we came from them. Right? And notice too, once something evolves, it stays here. The bacteria are still here. They've been here for 3.5 billion years, and they're still here, and they're still going strong. Right? It's not so much that things replace other things. Things go extinct, and sometimes they do get outcompeted. But that notion that we came from monkeys, and if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? There's so much wrong with that statement, right? We didn't come from monkeys, right? If this is our common ancestor, we have monkeys, and we have the old world monkeys and the new world monkeys. And then we also have the apes, including us, and the silverbacks and the orangutans and the chimpanzees and the bonobos, right? And so the common ancestor to all of those things was a really long time ago, a couple million years. All right, so the monkeys are still here because they fit fine into their environment. We diversify, we radiated out. Okay, all right, so that's systematics and taxonomy. I'm going back now just to see. Okay, so we got domains, and now within just the eukaryotes, we clarified kingdoms, right? The plant, animal, and fungus. And then within each of those, so let's talk about animals only, there are well over 35 or so phyla in the animal kingdom, the vast majority being invertebrate. All right, and so let's take us, we're chordates. That's phylum Chordata. You can drill down into different classes of chordates. All right, and so we are mammals, right? So we have, okay, here. We'll do the gray wolf here. So they're chordates, and within the chordates you have the mammals, right? Or you have things like the reptiles. Within the mammals, you got your carnivores, you got your herbivores, your omnivores. Within the carnivores, you have the Canidae, and within the Canidae, you have Canis. And within Canis, you have Canis lupus. Okay, so that's how taxonomy works. That's how we name things. We drill down or we drill up. And so all of the dogs that you know and love all come from a single species of wolf, or a single species of Canis, Canis lupus. And lupus, of course, means moon, because the dogs howl at the moon, right? Wolves howl at the moon. Okay. And so here is the current view of the phylogenetic tree of life. All right, there's the last universal common ancestor, your bacteria, your archaeans, and your eukaryotes. And you can see that all the eukaryotes came in common. Really, this is Protist, and they're the current Protists, right? And you can see here that there's a relationship between some green Protists, the green algae, and plants. That's called chromista. And then here are your opisthecons and your fungus and animals. Okay, all right. All right, so when it comes to what the origin of life is, I can tell you that, and this is something you'll talk about next semester too. So evolutionary theory gives us unity and diversity, not origin. What gives us origin is this concept called abiogenesis, the concept that life came from inorganic material, not inorganic material, but not life. All right, and you can click, there's some interesting science out there right now where we're showing that we can create self-assembling RNA. It's pretty cool. Okay. All right. So that's that. We can finally get to chemistry. And we got plenty of time still. All right. So that's the chemistry of water. That's when we're going to do that yet. We got chemistry here. All right. I'll tell you what, do you guys need, we've been pretty intense here. Do you guys need a 5-minute break before we start? Yeah, let's do that. All right, so here, I'm gonna set, hey Siri, set a timer for 5 minutes. I'm gonna pause the recording.